Now, for the first time ever, Bill Ayers walks into the Fox News headquarters to face tough questions about his past and his future.
So we have to talk about you and your domestic terrorist past. Let's start with this. How many bombings are you responsible for?
Weather Underground, I think, took credit for just slightly over 20 in a period when there were 20,000 bombings in the United States against the war.
And how about you personally?
Me personally, I've never talked about it, never will.
Okay. You could have hurt some people.
Absolutely.
You acknowledge that?
Absolutely.
You claim you never did, but you acknowledge the risks.
Oh, there was a terrible risk, and we actually did hurt. 3 of our own people died in the townhouse in New York City in 1970. And that was an incalculable, horrible, devastating loss, and yet what they were apparently planning to do would have been more devastating. And so it's a tragedy personally to us and to me. But yeah.
We'll get to that in a minute, and that was a nail bomb that they were putting together. But the Weather Underground began in 1969 with protests. It was over the over the Vietnam War. But it became more and more militant as the years passed, the early 70s. And in 1970, you declared a state of war against the U.S. government and urged your comrades, as you called them, to be more violent. Here is fellow weatherman Mark Rudd and your now wife, Bernadine Dorn.
We'd challenge each other to be more violent.
There's no way to be committed to nonviolence in the middle of the most violent society that history's ever created. I'm not committed to nonviolence in any way.
Why was more violence the answer?
You know, I wouldn't argue that more violence was the answer, but I do think
but those are your people.
Well, you know, what she said is I'm not committed to nonviolence. And
Mark Rudd was part of your group.
He was part of the Weathermen faction of SDS. He actually was never in the Weather Underground, but he was part of the...
But you were upping the violent rhetoric as well,
Bill. No question. Our rhetoric was, you know, outstripped a lot of what was going on. There's no question. But here's the reality. I was arrested opposing the war in Vietnam in 1965. Over the next 5 years, over the next 3 years, 5 years, I was arrested many times in demonstrations, in militant actions, sitting in at draft boards, all of it nonviolent, all of it an attempt to bring a screaming warning that we were killing 6,000 people a week. And when the war dragged on, after 1968, when a majority of people had come to oppose the war, largely through the efforts of people like Martin Luther King, the Black Freedom Movement, vets coming home and telling the truth, and the anti-war movement, those things came together and a majority opposed the war. Then the question was, how do we stop it if it won't stop? And this was a crisis for democracy and a crisis for the anti-war movement. In my own family, one of my brothers went to Canada, deserted the army, and I think he's a war hero for doing that. One of my brothers went to the communes, one joined the Democratic Party, tried to build a peace wing, and I did what I did.
You think Bo Bergdahl's a war hero too?
I think Bo Bergdahl, if he deserted, that was an heroic thing to do. Absolutely. Nobody knows if he did or he didn't. But I did blog about that because I think throughout history we should build monuments to the unknown deserters, the people who look at the craziness that they're asked to participate in and say, I'm not part of this.
Okay, so I hear you now explaining what, you know, those sound bites we heard from Bernadine Dorn, your now wife. She wasn't at the time, but she is now. Mark Rudd and so on. But to put it in context, as they and you and your group were calling for more violence, what we saw in February of 1970, February 16th, was San Francisco police officer Brian McDonnell, a 44-year-old father of 2 and husband, was killed when a bomb went off at his police station and 8 other police officers were injured in that blast. Now, your wife, Bernadine Dorn, has been accused of that crime. Do you deny it?
Absolutely deny it. Absolutely nothing to do with it. But if it were, so this is one of the things that keeps recycling.
And let me just tell them how it does, and I'll give you the floor. Larry Gratwall is somebody who infiltrated the Weather Underground. He claimed that you visited him in Buffalo in 1970 and complained that Bernadine Dorn had to do it herself, that bombing, because others, quote, weren't active enough in committing violence. And the San Francisco Police Union recently accused the Weather Underground of this murder.
Complete lies. And Larry Gratwall was in SDS, but he was never in the Weather Underground. And I did know him.
SDS was the precursor to the Weather
SDS was the student movement, exactly. And no, Larry Gratwall was lying, and the police union doesn't know what they're talking about.
Bernadine Dorn was not a fan of the police and referred to them typically as pigs.
Sisters and brothers, a year ago we blew away the Haymarket pig statue at the start of the youth riot in Chicago. The head of the Police Sergeants Association called emotionally for all-out war between the pigs and us. We accepted. Last night we destroyed the pig again.
It's 2.5 weeks since Fred Hampton was murdered by the pigs who own this city.
Well, that was, again, the inflated rhetoric of the time. Yes, the Black Panthers did that. We did that. Yes.
I mean, that sort of rhetoric is what sort of catches people's attention when she's calling them pigs and celebrating bad things happening to the police at the same time one gets murdered, and then you allegedly went and told Larry Graffwall she did it.
Never happened. But look, it's true that the rhetoric was inflated. It's also true. You take a situation like Chicago today, the police are a violent, out-of-control enterprise in Chicago today. The shooting of unarmed people again and again, the stopping of people on the street, the endless arrests in the black community.
Do you refer to them as pigs today?
No, I don't, because I hang. No, not really. We hang out with them at the coffee shop and talk to them. But we disagree. When you look at the Chicago Police Department, which has been involved in torture, and this is documented, been involved in torture, which has freed people off death row in the last 5 years because of a systematic practice of torture and forced confessions and so on. And these police officers are, every one of them isn't guilty, but every one of them is part of the conspiracy of silence. Absolutely.
5 days after that San Francisco bombing that took the life of Officer Brian McDonnell, the Weather Underground bombed John Murtaugh's home. John Murtaugh was...
That's also not true.
It's not true?
No, it's not true.
Judge Murtaugh was a trial court judge in New York State who was hearing a case involving the Panther 21, and your group objected to the way he was handling that case, and
well,
you came out...
we were supporting the Panther 21, there's no question.
That's right, and then his home got firebombed in the middle of the night. He had a 9-year-old boy in there named John who has been very public about this bombing. In your book with Bernadine, you quote the Weather Underground communique, and you say as follows, and I'm quoting now, 2 weeks before the townhouse explosion, which is a different bomb, 4 members of this group had firebombed Judge Murtaugh's house in New York as an action to support the Panther 21, whose trial was just beginning. To many people, this was a very good action. Within that group, however, the feeling developed that because this action had not done anything to hurt the pigs materially, it wasn't very important.
I didn't write that.
It's in your book.
Which book?
It's your book with Bernadine. It's on the board right there. Who will put it?
Racecourse.
It's from one of your communiques.
It's not my communique. That was an autonomous group. No, I think it was an autonomous group. I'm quite sure.
No, it's your wife's. And not only that, but a former Weatherground member, Kathy Wilkinson, further offered her own recitation of what happened, and she claims that the Weather Underground, while she was in it, perpetrated that crime.
She may have claimed it, but that's not true to my knowledge.
So she wasn't telling the truth either.
I don't think so.
John Murtaugh also believes that you, the Weather Underground, perpetrated that crime, and he's been on Fox News a few times. When I was hosting an afternoon show, he came on and he said the following. I want to give you a chance to respond. You're a 9-year-old little boy asleep in your bed, and what happens?
Actually, early in the morning of Washington's birthday, 4 bombs went off, 2 in the front of the house. There were 2 in the front that went off. There were bombs that they had placed under the gas tank of our car in the back of the house. The first 2 went off. The notion that Bill Ayers and the Weather Underground were about property damage, to make it sound like they were egging cars on Halloween night, is absurd. As far as I'm concerned, Kathy Boudin, Bill Ayers, Bernadine Dorn, and every one of them have blood dripping from their hands.
Not true. It was always property damage in our activities, always. And so it's just not true. But one
do you deny that Terry Robbins was responsible for that bombing? Because he was part of the Weather Underground. You two were very close.
We were very close, but he was in New York. I have no idea if he was, but I don't think he was. But he's gone, and so we don't know.
He's one of the guys who blew himself up.
That's exactly right. But, you know, one of the things I think is interesting about these activities of 40 years ago, I don't think it's bad to kind of stir through them and try to understand them.
Well, you've written about them extensively.
And I've written about them myself, absolutely. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think it would be fair and balanced to also look at the violence that was and is going on, perpetrated by the government, by the official agencies and organs of the government.
Well, let me just tell you what I hear when I hear that. I hear you saying, you sound like, with respect, Osama bin Laden.
What?
In order to evaluate my actions, which have hurt a lot of people, all right? I know you deny it, but there's evidence.
I deny
There's evidence that the Weather Underground was involved in these situations.
But when John Murtaugh says, for example, there's blood on your hands, what blood is he talking about?
He's talking about the San Francisco police officer. He's talking about the 3 Weather Underground individuals who were killed.
Right, but we had nothing to do with the San Francisco.
That's what you claim.
That's exactly right.
But there, of course, is evidence to the contrary. He's talking about the Brinks armored car incident, where 2 police officers and a security guard.
We were already above ground.
All right, we'll get to that in a minute. But there is evidence of it, and there was a former member of the Weather Underground who came out and said this is murder. What you guys got to the point where you considered murder, and you acknowledged that yourself. It got to the point where the property damage wasn't good enough for you. Still ahead, Bill Ayers reacts to the evidence that his group went way beyond vandalism, including the accusations from members of his own group. Watch how that goes next. Back now to my exclusive interview with Bill Ayers, the man behind one of the most violent radical groups of the 1960s and 70s, and his reaction to the evidence that despite his claims, his group went way beyond vandalism. You guys got to the point where you considered murder, and you acknowledged that yourself. It got to the point where the property damage wasn't good enough for you, and you decided on mass murder, planning to bomb a military dance. Now here's a bit of you and your fellow weathermen discussing that planned bombing with a nail bomb of a military dance you were going to bomb years later.
Terry, more than probably anyone else, represented the view that it was too late for any kind of reconciliation inside this country, and that the best that we could do was to bring about a catastrophic series of actions.
They had decided to set off the bomb at a non-commissioned officer's dance at Fort Dix. The idea being that there are no innocent in this war of aggression.
What we wanted to do here was deliver the most horrific hit that the United States government had ever suffered on its territory.
Yes, what I said was exactly right, that Terry had decided that it had to go further, and thank goodness it didn't, which I also said at the same moment.
But you understand, Professor, is that what began for your group as outrage over mass killings then turned into a plan to kill hundreds of Americans. Did you not cede the moral high ground?
Oh, absolutely, but for that was true for a few people, and it was one of the things we split on. So I write about it extensively in Fugitive Days. You should read it. It is an extensive explanation, and I don't defend it.
But
I think
as I hear you sitting, you don't sound remorseful.
But you want me to be remorseful for something I didn't do, rather than for the things I did do.
This is your group, Professor Ayres.
No,
this isn't some splinter.
No, that's not true.
Yes, it is.
That's not true.
It is true. This is the Weather Underground that was going to bomb military officers.
That's right, and we criticized it then and now, and we said it's wrong. It was wrong. It is wrong.
Professor, the only reason it didn't happen, the only reason it didn't happen is because the bomb blew up on those who were making it. And when it blew up, your girlfriend Diana Oughton was killed.
That's right.
And you later described her death as valiant.
Well, I later described an imaginary, nobody knows what happened, but what I imagine in Fugitive Days is her trying to stop that horrendous event from taking place. So that's how I describe it. And I describe it, I don't say that she was valiant. I don't say that.
You describe her death as valiant.
No, I talk about her trying to stop what would have been a horrendous
That's your imagination. How do you know she was against that bomb? She was in the townhouse when it exploded.
That's exactly right. And no one knows. You don't know. John Murtaugh doesn't know. But the idea that somehow this is the moral equivalent of 6,000 people a week being killed strikes me as nuts. We were destroying property, and in the course of discussion, some people thought we should go much further.
Your critics say when you make that argument, you sound like Adolf Hitler. Now, this is from the same documentary that we've been pulling clips from. This is a man who was part of the Weather Underground talking about you, saying you were closer to Hitler than you were to Gandhi. Listen.
They brought themselves, they were not brought, they brought themselves to that point. To the point at which they were ready to be mass murderers. This is mass murder we're talking about. They came to this conclusion, which is the conclusion that was come to by all the great killers, whether Hitler or Stalin or Mao, that they have a grand project for the transformation and purification of the world. And in the face of that project, ordinary life is dispensable.
That's Todd Gitlin. He was not in the Weather Underground. He was a leader of Students for Democratic Society. He's a professor at Columbia.
The predecessor.
And that quote to me is nuts. So you want to talk about who's in that grand tradition of destroying thousands, millions of people? It's the American war in Vietnam, where John McCain was in fact dropping bombs from the air on civilians, and he did it consistently.
And when the Weather Underground went into a townhouse and put together a bomb with nails in it.
Terrible thing.
And allegedly,
I agree with you.
And allegedly
Terrible
killed
thing.
a police officer, and bombed the home of John Murtaugh,
didn't kill a police
federal
officer.
judge with a 9-year-old boy in his bed.
We didn't kill a police officer, and so if
Deny it, but there's evidence to the contrary.
If there were evidence to the contrary, why isn't somebody on trial?
Doesn't mean they can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Well,
but the San Francisco Police Union says they believe you did it.
It's frankly not true. And John Murtaugh, that is also not true, but he has his opinion, but nobody was hurt or killed. The townhouse, as I said, was a terrible, terrible deviation.
The
and
communique that was issued by the Weather Underground claims credit for the Murtaugh home bombing.
Meanwhile, 6,000 people a week are being murdered.
Now, you made that point. That's back to the ends justify the means.
Is that not the slippery slope towards Mao and Hitler and the other?
That's back to the ends justify the means.
No, it's not.
Let me get back to this.
It's absolutely not.
Unless
you say the United States is saying the ends justify the means, which they often do say.
You got to the point where your group had to go underground after the townhouse bombing, where the bomb exploded on the street.
We decided to go underground. We didn't have to.
You went underground.
Yeah.
While underground, you stole, you lied, you hid, right? Any disagreement?
That's right.
You stole.
Onward, yes.
Yeah, you did. You wrote about it in your book.
We stole ID.
You stole purses. You stole wallets.
Well, yeah.
You stole money.
Some.
You ripped off dead babies' identities.
Right.
Yeah. And yet, the violence continued. Just because you went underground didn't mean the violence stopped.
What violence?
Well, June 9th, 1970, you bombed the New York City Police headquarters.
Okay, so now again, you're
March 1st. Let me just list it.
Yeah.
March 1st, 1971, you bombed the U.S. Capitol. May 19th, 1972, you bombed the Pentagon. January 29th, 1975, you bombed the State Department. That's what I mean by violence.
Yeah, that's actually destruction of property. So you can call it violence, but to equate it to the murder of human beings is nonsense. It doesn't
You realize
equate.
people could have been hurt. You admitted that at the beginning of the interview.
I said people could have been hurt, and thank God they weren't. And we made every attempt not to, and they weren't.
Do you appreciate the recklessness of that?
I don't say it wasn't reckless.
Who are you to potentially endanger the lives of those individuals who may have been in or around those buildings?
I don't say it wasn't reckless, and I don't say it wasn't illegal. It was illegal. We crossed lines of legality.
It's so much bigger than that, Professor Ayres.
We crossed lines of legality, maybe common sense.
You could have murdered somebody with those bombs.
And we didn't. But actually, the people who were conducting the war in Vietnam did actually murder people.
And so the answer is to then make yourself a murderer as well?
Do the ends of the fight against communism justify those means?
But you're answering a question with a question. Why don't you account for your own
I will, and you account for your reporting, because one of the things that
this is all from your book, sir.
Yeah, I know, but you talk about lies. Nothing's more clear than the systematic lying of the American government to get us into war after war after war.
You keep dodging. You keep dodging. You keep pointing to the government and not taking accountability.
No, I've said again and again, and I've said it in print, what I'm responsible for, what I'm not responsible for. But it's hard to get me to admit that I'm responsible for something I didn't do.
Well, you keep saying
you
did these bombings, the Weather Underground. You admitted that Weather Underground did 20 bombings. That's your group.
And I would not apologize for destroying property in defense of stopping 6,000 people.
And as soon as it crosses over to somebody being injured, you deny it.
No, I think that would have been a real problem.